Welcome to Practical English Lesson 22. Today is Tuesday, August the 4th. My name is Darcy, and tonight we are talking about literature. This is part 3 in an ongoing series. In parts 1 and 2, lessons 14 and 18, we explored the forms of literature, the novel, poetry, and drama, or the screenplay, the script, as well as the elements of a story: plot, character, narrator, conflict, resolution, theme, and then the different types of literary devices, techniques of writing, and figures of speech. And at the end of the lesson, I will give you a QR code to scan where you can go back, where I can give you a link to watch the previous lessons, give you the worksheets at the end of the lesson, okay? Now, I usually include a worksheet, and I will include one after the lesson as well, but I'm not going to include the worksheet now. I'll upload it later, okay? So tonight, what we want to do is continue with the exploring of literary techniques. We basically looked at what a story is, how a story works, what are the components of a story. We've looked at the genres of fiction, such as like comedy and tragedy and mystery and science fiction and horror and romance and adventure and so on. Right? Those are the genres of fiction, the elements of the story. And tonight, last lesson, we also looked at the literary devices or figures of speech, figurative language that writers and speakers, basically everybody, use in communication, in writing, right? So a literary technique or a literary device, such as metaphor or symbolism, it's just part of the workings of how we think. It's the makeup of our psychology, really. We grew up in a culture that is long influenced by historical works of literature. And I think in the previous lesson we talked about, what literature came out of storytelling and drama. There wasn't any system of writing, but people were role-playing, basically. People were reenacting the stories of their heroes, and that became, art, the art of drama, which then evolved into literature, writing of the novel and poetry and so on, right? So in the modern day, literary critics, somebody who studies literature, a literary critics have built up a system of terminology and ways of analyzing texts. Written text can be fictional or non-fictional, right? It could be an essay, which I have something planned for in a future lesson, essays. We could say that literary techniques, literary devices, are a form of persuasion, or what is also known as rhetoric, right? So when you're trying to persuade somebody or give somebody a memorable experience, you don't just recount the events, tell the story in a linear fashion, just going through, person A did this and this and this and this, right? And person B did this and this and this and this. This makes no sense to us. In storytelling, we come up with methods of sort of recreating the experience that other people can imagine and understand. So that's what a literary device is, and it's used in everyday speech. It's used in fictional writing. It's used in non-fictional writing, and I would say that the ideas originally presented in these like classical works of literature have influenced society, have influenced culture over, over the centuries, over the ages, so that certain like literary characters, literary events, and quotations, things that fictional literary characters have said, have become um, ingrained in our everyday speech. Painters have been inspired by ideas given by writers, and so we have like famous paintings visually depicting scenes from the great stories. Okay, so painters also in the visual arts, painting and drama or theater, and nowadays movies, cinema. There's the same thing, the same kinds of persuasive techniques, literary techniques can be used. Okay, so that's what makes this a really interesting topic to look at. It's not just about books; it's actually about like all of culture, and so that's what we hope to try to get a handle on tonight. Okay, yeah, we see imagery, personification, anthropomorphism, simile, metaphor, symbolism, hyperbole. That's what we discussed in the previous lesson. And tonight we'll be looking at alliteration, rhyme, allusion, analogy, allegory, aphorism, archetype, context, connotation, and denotation. Now, these are pretty advanced terms, and I have to admit I didn't really know the meaning of a lot of these terms when I began drafting this lesson. And I don't want you guys to feel intimidated by this terminology. In many ways, a lot of these terms kind of mean the same thing. You can simplify a lot of these terms as metaphor or symbolism. Hopefully you know what metaphor and symbolism is. So personification, anthropomorphism, simile, symbolism, hyperbole, analogy, allegory, these are all, kind of metaphorical or symbolic, let's say. Okay, so we'll look at these like formal definitions and hopefully some examples as well. Well, and some examples as well. That's what we want to do tonight, and hopefully after learning about some of this, you'll have a better appreciation of. I forgot to mention music. We have some music to play tonight as well. The lyrics, the poetry of music uses literary devices almost exclusively to give us an emotional feeling or to give us an experience, something that we can imagine and understand vividly. So we'll also, if we have time, look a little bit at the life of Shakespeare. And in future literature lessons, we'll be continuing with profiling the lives and works of great authors. Okay, so to review, literary devices refer to the artistic structures used by writers to convey their message to readers. So it's the style, the means of persuasion to impress, their ideas through their writing, through their speech to their readers and audiences. They can help the reader enjoy, interpret, and analyze literary work. Sometimes the writer is not going to give you the deeper meaning, like explicitly, the moral, the lesson of the story, but they will give little hints to try to get the reader to consider the deeper meanings. And so the clues that they use are the choice of words and arrangement of ideas and so on. They add beauty and depth of meaning. They challenge and stimulate the reader's imagination, understanding, and emotional responses. Literary devices have two aspects. They can be literary elements or literary techniques. Literary elements, those are the parts of a story, okay? The plot, the events that take place, the setting, where and when, the narrative structure, who is telling the story, the characters, good and bad, Themes, morals, the types of stories, also genre, I guess, like tragedy, comedy, etc. Okay, these are the fundamental parts of any like fictional story. Poetry is a little different. Literary techniques are the structures in the text that writers employ to assist their readers to better understand and appreciate the literary work. Okay, and maybe as adults it's difficult for us to really appreciate that, but younger audiences, children are very imaginative, and they think very symbolically and very creatively. So when we look at things like fairy tales and fables and myths, those ancient shorter forms of stories, those are the seed of all of the later works of literature. Okay, so this is what we talked about previously, and we just want to review it. Imagery. Okay, imagery. The writer could say it was night, or the writer could say the beautiful starry night sky beckoned him to wonder in awe. So the writer is using more descriptive language to give the reader something they can use to, in their mind, imagine the scene that the character is in and appreciate it, enjoy it, experience it, right? Visually descriptive or imagery is visually descriptive or figurative language, and we could say that the artist here has exaggerated certain features to not just give you a visual copy or representation, but a feeling that goes along with it. Personification. We project into the world our own internal thoughts and emotions, beliefs, and so on. So the early people, the ancient people, saw nature as the workings of gods, and they created a whole pantheon of gods, and then they simplified it down to one monotheistic god, being the ruler over some demigods or angels and so on. It's all just imaginative. And it says something about who we are and how we instinctively interpret the world. Like through science, we can kind of break down these old ideas and see that they no longer really work. They no longer stand up to the scientific method. But they still do tell us something about how we instinctively feel about life and society and nature. Okay? Personification. We also have another word, anthropomorphism. So personification is where we project human qualities onto the world, and anthropomorphism is another word for projecting human qualities onto animals. Okay? So the attribution of human characteristics or behavior to, it should just be animal. And Aesop's fables use animals like foxes and cranes and lions and mice as characters having human qualities. So here's a scene from Aesop's fables with the fox and the raven. And there's a little story about how the fox likes to trick the raven. There's a few stories like this. So, the fox is a symbol or a metaphor. Like a fox is a predatory canine, and in literature and in everyday figures of speaking, manners of speaking, I guess, when we refer to someone as a fox, we are pointing out that they are clever and untrustworthy, a little predatory, and not to be trusted. Okay, so a cunning fox. A fox is just a predatory canine, but when we say a fox is cunning, well, that's a projection, the personification And symbolism. A symbol is a thing that represents or stands for something else. A material object representing something abstract. Here we have like this painting by Salvador Dali, and there's a rose floating in the sky. So actually, in this particular painting, or in the context that the artist has given it to us, it's unusual. It's completely out of context. You see part of a flower floating in the sky. We have to think, what does it mean to us, or what did it mean to the painter who painted it? We know that like the rose is commonly a symbol of passion, romance, and so on. Okay, and then you can kind of see like if you do look very closely down at the bottom, there are like a couple shadowy figures, a silhouette of a couple. So that adds more to the meaning there when you see the rose juxtaposed with a gigantic rose floating in the sky, and then a small silhouette of a couple of people standing in a desert, right, at sunset or something like that. Make of it what you will. A metaphor is a figure of speech in which a word or a phrase is applied to an object or action to which it's not literally applicable. So, yeah, you can interpret it any way you like. Rose is commonly a symbol of romance and matrimony, or marriage. And red is the symbol of strong emotion and passion. And there's a little quote down below. I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the grave. Hyperbole is an exaggerated statement. Kind of a metaphor, but it's an exaggeration. So Superman is the Man of Steel. Fictional character, practically invincible, strong as steel and faster than a speeding bullet. Okay, moving on to new material, poetry. A poem is a piece of writing in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by attention to diction, involving rhyme, rhythm, and imagery. Now, diction is the choice of words. So we have thousands of words. And diction is the classification of words. So some words are more academic or sacred and spiritual. Others are more common and colloquial. Some can be quite vulgar, right? Vulgar language is the language you're not supposed to use in front of your superiors or your parents or your family or anything like that, right? You don't want to use that kind of language. That's vulgar language, or, it's language intended to convey emotion and attitude, basically. But when we're trying to communicate something higher than that, like something spiritual or sacred or intensely emotional in a good way, we use different kinds of words, okay? That's diction. And then, again, like the means of delivery or presentation, the style of presentation is strengthened by the structure of the verse using rhyme and rhythm. Poetic features include rhyme, rhythm, and alliteration. A sonnet is a kind of a poem using 14 lines, only 14 lines, any number of formal rhyme schemes. So that's kind of a poem. I'm not looking at poetry too much tonight. But the difference between rhyme and alliteration. Rhyme is when the words sound the same, like hat and cat. Okay. Here, if you look at this poem here, you can see day, and then you can see down below fade and shade. Okay, so that's intentional. That's put there intentionally. That's rhyme there. Alliteration, the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning or adjacent, closely connected. So consonants. She sells seashells at the seashore, and sweet birds sing. Writers and speech writers, public speakers, people working in marketing, advertising and so on, recognize that it's attention getting, like it's what we call like sensually. It's sensual. We enjoy it. We just naturally enjoy it. Say a silly poem to a child, they'll start laughing, right? We just naturally, instinctively enjoy these kinds of sounds. And so literary critics call that alliteration, and writers use that to great effect, commonly. Rhyme. The correspondence of sound between words, especially the endings of words. A short poem where the sound of the word or the syllable, one syllable word, two syllable words, the sound of the word or syllable at the end of each line corresponds with that at the end of another. And here we see, like Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland character, Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. It's pretty meaningless, but we enjoy the wordplay. Allegory. Allegory is another form of metaphor. We could say that a metaphor or a symbol put into a fictional piece of writing or poetry calls on some very ancient idea, basically, carried on through the generations. Like we have emotional responses to certain objects, like dogs and dangerous predators, let's say. Those are symbols of danger, let's say. A dog is a symbol of friendship, and a wolf is a symbol of danger, let's say. So those are symbols, and a symbol and a metaphor is like taking something happening in the story and referring it to an abstract idea that we instinctively understand. We can just make the comparison without much thought. In an allegory, the writer is making a metaphor out of a real-world situation. So they are fictionalizing something out of the real world. That's what an allegory is. A literary technique in which an abstract idea is given form of characters, actions, or events. And here we see George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is an allegory of the overthrow of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II and the communist revolution of Russia before World War II. So the events and the types of characters in this story loosely follow and, let's say, caricature real events, historical events, and people. That's the power of literature right there, the power of fictional writing. It can change history because it changes our interpretation of history. Allusion is very similar to allegory. It's an indirect reference to a person, place, thing, or idea of historical, cultural, literary, or political significance. So, often used as a passing comment, the writer expects the reader to possess knowledge to spot the allusion and grasp its importance in a text. In other words, an allusion is a reference. Character gives a reference. Here we see a painting of Hamlet, right? This painting is a depiction of the Shakespearean character Hamlet. You could say that this painting itself is an allusion because it is referencing a character from somebody else's writing, okay? And then the character is holding a skull, which could be a symbol in and of itself, but the skull is the skull of a deceased character from before the story began, and that itself is an allusion. The writer is helping the reader understand the setting and the sort of the pretext of the plot. What the story will go on from this. The character needs to allude to previous characters and events to help the reader understand where the character is now. And this gives realism to the story. You could say those like quote unquote Easter eggs. I think that movie Ready Player One was a fantastic example of allusion, because in virtually every single scene of this film, Ready Player One, there were pop culture allusions, like multiple pop culture allusions in every scene, basically. King Kong and the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park, and the spaceship from Star Wars or whatever. Go ahead and watch Ready Player One by Steven Spielberg to understand, like, an Easter egg, quote unquote, is just an illusion, basically, where the creators, the writers, the artists put references to other works of fiction or real world events, real world places, people, into the story to give it realism and to build the universe up a little bit. So Hamlet, and in Shakespeare's play, Hamlet was kind of an allusion, Hamlet was an allusion to the character Hercules in Roman Greek mythology. Also in nearly all of the classical works of literature, there's heavy reference or allusion to the Bible. And the Bible itself contains allusions. It references itself. So stories that occur later on in the Bible are referencing people and characters from earlier on in the Bible. And the Bible is a collection of different books or stories written over hundreds of years, and yet they all try to build on to create like a continuous narrative, basically. An allegory is very similar to a metaphor. An analogy is very similar to a metaphor. A comparison in which an idea or thing is compared to another thing, that's what a metaphor is. It explains an idea. It's difficult to separate an analogy from a metaphor. But a metaphor is a symbol. A metaphor, a rose, is kind of a metaphor for, without saying explicitly the feeling, you give a rose, and that is the metaphor. It's a symbolic gesture of the idea of affection, okay? That's just a metaphor. An analogy is a kind of a saying, a sentence, an idiom, a figure of speech, right? And that makes a comparison between something imaginary, like this sword and pen, to life itself. We're making a general claim, a general statement about a situation in life. It's a wise saying, an aphorism, which we'll get to in a second. So the pen is mightier than the sword is a popular idiom. And literally, of course, a sword can easily destroy a pen. But the idea communicated through a pen has broader and longer lasting effects than committing an act of violence. Some other examples: finding a needle in a haystack is an expression we use when we are encountering a situation where we have to look very carefully for something almost imperceptible, looking for a small needle in a pile of straw. The rat race is an analogy. A rat running through a maze is like an analogy of how we go about our lives in the chaotic society. Now, this word here, ambiguity, like something that is ambiguous. When when you're asked how are you, and you say I'm fine, that's a very ambiguous response. In other words, no authentic, honest meaning is given there. the way you say it could be like, it could give a little bit more meaning. Like you could say, I'm fine. Or you could say, I'm fine. Or you could say, I'm fine, right? Each one of those has its own emotion to it, I guess. The sentence itself, I'm fine, is totally ambiguous. So it's a word, a phrase, a statement that contains any kind of meaning. And it's also vague. And I use this example here. If you look carefully at this painting, you see two things happening at the same time. The immediate thing that you see is an old man with a bald head and some like wavy blonde hair. But then you recognize that it doesn't quite match up. You see the face, but it's not connected to a body, right? You recognize that actually that's a road. And then you recognize that the hand is actually a dog. And then if you look closely, you notice an archway with two people standing inside the archway. And the hair is some straw that a woman is, well, yeah. So these are farmers and they're carrying straw. And you can even see off in the right corner on another face, basically. We have a tendency to recognize faces everywhere. So this author is using that tendency, that psychological innate tendency to recognize faces and creating all these different kind of paintings to give us this optical illusion. An aphorism is a statement of truth, like an analogy. It's a witty, wise, true saying. Proverbs, maxims, adages, cliches are different forms of aphoristic statements that gain prevalence from generation to generation. Carpe diem is a Latin aphorism for seize the day or take control. And I'll have more to say on aphorisms in another lesson. An archetype. So we probably already recognize that a lot of movies and books tell the same story, featuring the same kinds of characters. There's only so many ways you can tell a story, and the great storytellers recognize that there's really just 2 or 3 types of stories that people are actually interested in. Anything that strays away from that is experimental, and it's not going to be very popular, right? I mean, a small group of people, a small percentage of people will enjoy it because it's unique, but it's not the conventional formulaic, pattern of storytelling that we come to expect. So an archetype is a typical kind of a character or a situation. It's a cliche. It's something that we recognize present in all of the great works of art and works of fiction. So it's a universal symbol. It represents universal patterns in human nature. And let me just have a look here. Yeah, if we look at this more closely, we can see there are like 12 kinds of characters. The outlaw or the bad, the anti-hero, let's say, the bad boy. The one who isn't necessarily evil, but often breaks the rule because they're motivated by liberation, right? You have the layers of motivation, basically, the innate drives. Some of us are motivated by peace and safety and security. Others are motivated by power and freedom. Okay? That's what this diagram is showing. And so you can have an individual type of a character existing on this type of a spectrum. The outlaw is the anti-hero, the one who breaks the rules and criticizes the idiotic and corrupt system in the hopes of, liberating liberating one's self or changing the society. We have the explorer, somebody who is more spiritual, doesn't really care about power and justice, but is interested in freedom. We have the sage, who is interested more in traditional wisdom and understanding, introspection, reflection, observation, let's say. We have the hero, who is like Captain America, the good, polite, completely honorable, virtuous, and perfect type of a character. If you'd like to explore this diagram later, you can rewatch this lesson or join the study group where I will provide the slides for this. So the archetype was given its name, like it always existed, but it was Carl Jung that sort of articulated it. Swiss psychologists argued that the root of the archetype is a collective unconscious. The collective unconscious refers to experiences shared by, a people. China has its archetypal characters, mythological characters. The Western world has their archetypal characters. And they actually share the same characteristics, like heroism and, great wisdom and virtue and generosity. And these kinds of experiences, love, religion, death, birth, life, struggle, survival, these are archetypal events. A lot of stories focus on these kinds of events. We like to look at these events in literary fictional context to gain some understanding of these events, which may be kind of threatening to us or unfamiliar, and we'd like to learn more about it. Okay. An archetypal hero. Joseph Campbell defined the archetypal hero in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. The archetypal hero starts out having a normal life. His normal life is disrupted by tragedy. He or she must set off on an adventure to achieve a goal for survival. And the hero then ends up living happily ever after accomplishing his or her goal. Okay. Context. Context. Well, you've probably heard this word before. You might have tried to use this word before. It's a very general term. This diagram symbolizes it quite well, I think. We see a grouping of letters, but we are instinctively able to recognize the pattern, Context, right? It's Context. It's not in any kind of linear order there, other than the C and the O and the N are at the top. But then you have Text. Like, you can read it from left to right, but it's in a circle. We don't typically read in this fashion, but we instantly recognize it says context. So we're able to piece together the clues, let's say. Context means the circumstances forming a background of an event, idea, or statement in such a way as to enable readers to understand the narrative or literary piece. So the setting, the when and the where, is the context of the story. And the theme, like good versus evil, or, violence and tragedy, or comedy and romance, or something like that. Like, that's the background. And what's in the foreground are the characters and the things that they say, their dialogue, right? Like, if we looked at that painting, again, referenced here, right? The context is the wall and the archway. And what's in the foreground are those two people. And together it makes a kind of a scene. And you're free to interpret it any way you like. Just enjoy it. Context is about providing a background picture of the situation and of who is involved. Context is an essential part of a literary text, which helps to engage the audience. If the writer ignores context, they may overlook a critical aspect or the story's intent. So, again, diction and tone. If you have this very serious tone in the story where the stakes are high and there's a lot of tension, and a character makes a stupid joke, that's completely out of context and it breaks the tone. Okay. Now Marvel did a really great job of that. Marvel was able to perfectly balance having silly humor imposed at key moments. That's called comic relief, right? It's a little bit out of context, and that's what makes it really funny, right? Unexpected. But when you have something completely out of context, like if you have in a sort of a realistic mystery story, and then at the end it's revealed that an alien is the suspect. There's no setup for that, so the alien is out of context. Then he makes when you try to combine realism with science fiction, it's not going to work. Readers have a set of expectations. Audiences have their expectations, and everything should fit in that framework, basically. When a writer uses a quote or a fact from some source, it becomes necessary to provide the readers about the source. Like, you can read this story, Animal Farm, and enjoy it in and of itself because the writer is a very skilled storyteller. But the writer was also a journalist and a historian, and was able to kind of impose this fictional story with fictional characters, anthropomorphic characters, animals, to make it an allegory of a real historical event, and through satire to criticize the events, make kind of fun of the events. So context, when readers recognize that the writer was criticizing and satirizing certain powerful people, this book became very dangerous. It still is to this day, in fact. Now, without context, readers may not see the true picture. So writers sometimes try to hide their intents, their attitudes, in ambiguity, in metaphor. And the readers can't actually get what the writer is trying to say. There hasn't been enough context given until maybe the very end, like in a mystery. Of course, a mystery is all about hiding information from the reader and revealing it slowly, so that by the time the reader gets to the end of the story, they have all of the information and they can look back at how the writer was foreshadowing in the beginning of the story. And the reader has this aha moment where everything fits perfectly into place. Context helps readers understand cultural, social, philosophical, and political ideas. Okay, in context, considered together with the surrounding words or circumstances. So everything in this painting is perfectly balanced in such a way that you can see two things at the same time. And it fits in nicely. Like if you really look at it carefully, you want to see the old man, you move back a little bit and you just kind of recognize the features of a face. You come in close and now you can recognize what the scene actually is. Everything fits in perfectly in context. And this is Salvador Dali again with out of context surrealism. You see this like what looks like a branch, but it's disjointed. It's not actually a branch at all. You see what look like clocks, but they are kind of melting. You see these floating bullets and fish, right? Like Nothing makes sense. It's not supposed to make sense. You can look at this as long as you want. You'll never actually come to any kind of actual meaning. I mean, anything that you interpret from this painting is your own subjective experience, and that was the painter's intent there. Okay, maybe we won't do Shakespeare today. Connotation and denotation. So I mentioned that in the beginning, diction, those high caliber words, those special, spiritual, sacred words, and then those vulgar, insulting words, right? They're just words, right? It's just a sound, an utterance that people make with their mouths, but they do have emotional attachment, okay? So denotation is generally defined as the literal dictionary meaning of a word, in contrast to its connotative or associated meanings. The rose is a flower with red petals, but it connotes romance. Writers commonly deviate from literal meanings of words to create the new and more interesting experience to the reader. Okay, metaphor, imagery, using those words that have emotional, connotative meaning. Figurative language. Connotative meanings of words allow writers to add to their works dimensions that are broader and more vivid. Abstract concepts can be compared to objects and events in nature in order to better understand and express an idea. So when you stack words having similar connotative meaning, the writer is reinforcing the theme or the underlying idea, the abstract idea in their style of speaking, basically. There's an expression to read between the lines. What isn't said is being kind of alluded to through the choice of words that connote a certain kind of feeling or perhaps allude to a symbol or okay, so figures of speech like metaphor, simile, symbolism, and personification all employ connotative words to create new and creative ideas. Wall Street. Wall Street is a street in Manhattan, but Wall Street is a symbol of power, financial power. Discipline. It has a kind of feeling when you hear the word discipline, you think of the pain and struggle involved in self-discipline, doing things against our innate natural will to be better, basically. So, a dove literally is a bird. It's kind of a pigeon, basically. But in literature, it's symbolic of peace and gentleness. The eagle, strength and power. The owl, wisdom, introspection. And the vulture, a symbol of death. So a writer could create a scene. It's done in the Bible where after the flood, a twig is delivered by a dove to the character Noah. The scene itself does two things. It indicates that a bird flew away and found a piece of land because there was no land. Everything was flooded. So the bird brings back a piece of a tree, a stick, a twig, right? And this helps the reader understand that land is to be found somewhere, right? But then it takes on this deeply spiritual meaning that the dove was sent by God as a gesture of forbearance and forgiveness, let's say. So the olive branch is what the dove was carrying, and when we deliver an olive branch, it means we are making a gesture of peace and reconciliation. So there's a couple symbolism, a couple of symbols associated with the dove, because of how they're referenced, alluded to in popular works of literature. The eagle is the symbol of American power, or any kind of empire, basically. Yeah. So the writer can put these kinds of animals in their scenes, like vultures were flying overhead, let's say, meaning that something tragic is happening. Or in Harry Potter, you have the owl as Harry Potter's animal, and the owl knows secrets. So metaphors are words that connote meanings that go beyond their literal meanings. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Shakespeare compares a woman to a summer day in that sonnet. The summer day is the metaphor, but it doesn't reference any kind of symbol per se. Summer day is something that Shakespeare made up. Shakespeare understood that when we think of summer, it connotes warmth and happiness and energy and life and all of that stuff, right? Winter connotes darkness and so on. So comparing a woman to a summer day, it's a simple and straightforward statement. And so writers can, come up with new forms of metaphor when they can grasp the connotative meanings of words, the feelings that words convey. And so I'm going to conclude this lesson with this song. And it was referenced earlier. I just think that this is a really great example, a simple example of a piece of poetry that employs virtually all of the literary techniques that have already been mentioned in this lesson and in the previous lesson. So we're going to listen to the song. I wasn't able to get the video, but we'll listen to the song and you can read along. Yeah, just a moment.
There used to be a graying tower alone on the sea. You became the light on the dark side of me. Love remains a drug that's the high and not the pill. But did you know that when it snows, my eyes become a lot, and the light that you shine can't be seen? I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the grave. Ooh, the more I get of you, the stranger it feels, yeah. And now that your rose is in bloom, a light hits the gloom on the grave. There is so much a man can tell you, so much he can say. You remain my power, my pleasure, my pain, baby. To me you're like a grown addiction that I can't deny. Won't you tell me, is that healthy, baby? But did you know that when it snows, my eyes become a lot, and the light that you shine can't be seen? Baby, I compare you to a kiss from a rose on the grave. Ooh, the more I get of you, the stranger it feels, yeah. Now that your rose is in bloom, a light hits the gloom on the grave.
Um, so a graying tower on the sea. That's a lighthouse. And a lighthouse is a tower that sits on the coastline, and it shines a light so that ships can know not to get too close to that area of land. So he's alluded to a lighthouse, and then he compares the subject of his song to the light on the dark side, like the other half, basically. The lighthouse has a light that moves in a rotating motion. So, he's saying that this is the lighter half of himself, and he is a lighthouse. Then he makes a different kind of a metaphor here. Love remained a drug that's high and not the pill. So, the pill, I don't know, it has a connotation with a bitter pill to swallow. You take a pill when you're sick. A drug is something you take when you're sick. But a drug can be a feeling inside of you. People take drugs, painkillers, for example, to chemically activate drugs that the body produces naturally. So love remained a drug that's the high. I'm just saying it's a good feeling here. Imagery. When it snows, my eyes become large. And the light that you shine can't be seen is a question. That's very ambiguous there. That's a completely ambiguous statement, but he's using some interesting imagery here. When it snows, my eyes become large, and the light that you shine can't be seen. So when winter comes, I don't, the poet, the singer here, loses his light. Okay. Then he makes another metaphor, a kiss from a rose on the gray. So something that is vividly colorful, red on the gray, the night sky, the snow. The contrast he's making is alone, he is cold and gray and without life, and with her, she is light and color and the rose. Right? A light hits the gloom on the gray. Gloom is another like imagery word for gray and dark, okay? So I just include this poem because it's such a great example of employing multiple types of literary devices. Imagery, metaphor, irony, and ambiguity, like the light that you shine can't be seen is a question mark. Alliteration, you remain my power, my pleasure, my pain. PPP, right? Alliteration. It's very powerful the way he says it too. You remain my power, my pleasure, my pain. That's the pre-chorus basically. It builds up to the great, climactic moment there. And then he references again the drug alluded to earlier. You're a growing addiction that I can't deny. Won't you tell me that's healthy? Again, ending it as a question. So I think this song won multiple Grammys back in the day when the Grammys actually stood for something. And so I mentioned that these were the literary devices that hopefully you have an understanding and appreciation for what they are and how they work and why they can help you in your day-to-day communication writing. Okay? I know it's a broad, deep, complicated subject. You don't have to understand every bit of it, but this is your introduction to that, okay? Imagery, personification, simile, metaphor, symbolism, alliteration, rhyme, allusion. Some of these things communicate ideas. Others are just wordplay to create a sensual experience when we hear and when we read them. It's very powerful.